Composite Gloves here, and this is the 23rd Kontakt from the Ground Up tutorial series or video in the tutorial series, whatever. And today we're talking about the Waveform Editor, and we're just going to cover the basic functions. Now today I'm actually running this in standalone, and I'm doing it for a specific reason because you can do some pretty cool things in standalone that I think are just better for the Waveform Editor itself. So we've already talked about the group editor and the mapping editor. So now let's talk about this thing called the wave editor. Now I've got the clarinet instrument opened. So that is where our samples are coming from. We're just going to talk about these top rows because it gets pretty intense as we go. Now I'm going to briefly cover loops. You can enable a loop by clicking one of these guys, and boom, it pops up. And if you have a loop that you don't want, you can, if we move our endpoint, there's a little X, you can get rid of that. That's how we're going to solve that problem for now. But we're going to go back to our loop 1. So select loop 1, and actually, you know what? We're going to get rid of this too, and we'll make one as we go. So you can actually edit samples in Kontakt, and there are, so if you want to do zone work, you can. And it's really cool the options you have here. Real quick though, if you come up to your wave editor, you see you have this little button. This is only available in standalone, which is why I'm in standalone, but you can actually click it and bang, it comes out of the rack, and you have these size options. And this can be really nice to get a good view. And you'll see there are two views of our waveform. This is stereo information. If it was mono, they'd look exactly the same, but it is stereo because they look different. So that is pretty cool. And there are a variety of options they give us down here to change things. But we're just going to talk about these first rows because it gets a little intense. So we have our size option, only available in standalone. And then you have your zoom tool. So this tool is pretty cool, very handy for moving around your sample. You simply click and drag where you want to see, and it will zoom in on that. If you want to zoom back out, you simply click, and it will zoom back out. And if you zoom in a lot, it'll take multiple clicks to zoom all the way out. So you could say, I want to see just this part, and then maybe you want to see really close up what's going on, and you could just zoom out by clicking. So that's a really nifty way of going about it. Now we're going to make a loop. So come down here to your sample loop and then push number 1, and you'll see a loop pops up, and there's all these features going on right here. So we're going to cover this later, but we need a loop. And what it'll do is it'll play our sample, and when it reaches this point, it'll go back to where our loop has been set, and we have a little volume fade in, and it will loop through that. So now this button right here goes to the starting point of your sample. So if we've been zoomed in here, if we're like way over here, and we're like, oh man, we need to see the very beginning of our sample, wherever our starting point is, you just click this button, and bang, it takes you there. Now it takes you to wherever your starting point is set, and that's actually set right here. So you could drag this button up or down to change where it actually starts. So if we move it and we click that, it'll move to wherever that is. And you see it's labeled with a little S to indicate that it's the starting point. We're going to put it back at the beginning. Now this first function will take us to the starting point of our loop. And so bang, we just moved to the starting point of our loop. This will center us on our loop. So now our entire loop is centered before us. And if we zoom out a little bit, you'll see that that was true. And then this will take us, if we zoom in like way over here, like, oh man, I need to get to the end of my loop. You click this and bang, you're taken to the end of your loop. And then this takes you to the end point of the sample. So again, this is a point that's set. So you can, actually change that by going over here to sample end. I believe that's what it stands for. And you can move the endpoint. And if you click this, it'll take you to where that is. So it's got a little E on it. And that is how those things work. So there you have it. Now, when you're creating loops to loop through your sample, and you do this for like choirs and stuff, that way you can make a sample go on forever until you release the key, like a choir. But then you have all these like weird things about clicks and pops and just all sorts of madness. And so how do you deal with that? Well, you can change the snap setting. So if we zoom in real close like here, we'll see our waveform, and this is covered in my DSP Basic series. If you haven't watched that yet, go check it out if you don't know, basic stuff about sound. But we have our waveform, and where our waveform crosses the 0 point line, that's called the 0 point crossing. And this is negative amplitude, positive amplitude. with air pressure waves and stuff. So all sorts of cool things. But this snap setting, when we're making our loop, will change where our loop automatically snaps in our waveform. So if we change it to snap to 0 point crossing, it hasn't snapped yet because you still have to move it manually. So take your zoom tool off, and if we move it, you'll see that it now snaps to a 0 point crossing. And if we go to the other end of our loop, which is now you can see why these are kind of useful, you can move this as well. Now if we move it to none, so now neither one's selected, you simply click on the one you had selected to do that. You can move it anywhere in the sample. So let's say we wanted to start at this particular phase in our waveform. Again, DSP series explains that. And you want your other sample though, because if we go to the other end, oh no, we're going to click because we're going to go instantly from, well, with the fade in we won't, but let's get rid of that. But if we were to, if we were to go from instantly loud to soft at the 0 point crossing, positive amplitude to nothing, then we're going to have a click. We don't want that. So we can go to our snap to loop value crossing. What this does is it says, hey, this guy, oh, whoops, let's take this off. So what this does is it says, hey, this guy is at a positive amplitude. So if we want to avoid clicks and stuff, it's going to look for the nearest waveform. As you can see, it already did it. That is at a positive amplitude. So if we switch it now, whoa, my sample just got crazy. My loop zone. So if we switch it now, we will notice that it has now been zoomed in as such. So these things can only move in that area. So anyways, those are your snap settings, and that helps get rid of clicks and pops. Now remember, it's looking for just a point in the waveform. So if your waveform is really soft or really loud, you may get unusual and weird results. But that's one way of doing it if you need really clear, crisp transition. And you could set these snap settings. Remember, you have to move your ends of the waveform for them to take effect though. Now we have this little options menu right here. What is this? Well, this is find loop end, and it will basically say, it'll look for the best part for your loop to end. So when it loops, it's clean. It will automatically just kind of figure out for you what it thinks, and it will do it within your endpoint. So if you have an endpoint, if we move our endpoint like way up, it will stay before this. So it only has this much room to choose an optimal point. And so if we do this, find loop in short, it will stay within. And you see it moved a little bit because it thinks this is a better point to loop at based on like values in math and algorithms and things. If you go find loop and long, if it deems that there's a point out here that is actually better than a point before the end, it will take it because now it no longer cares about where you said to end. And so as you see, it just moved past our end sample point. And so that is what those things do. And that could be really useful for you. Okay, so that's the options. And if we come down here to restore loops from samples, some waveform files, such as wave.wave files in AIFF, I believe. No, FLAC. I can't remember which one. They can carry metadata that contains samples already. It's called acidized. If you export in FL Studios, if we come up here, go to File, Export, and then if we went to like Wave File, and we selected a place to do it, you'd actually see that we have the option to save acidized, and that will save, and save slice markers. I think I have them a little mixed up right now. But anyways, you could save data into your sample, and this will recover that data, this setting. We'll say restore loops from samples. So it'll figure out already where your samples slice points are, and it will say, oh, okay, that's where they are, and use those instead for your loops and stuff. So that is a really nifty way, especially if you do things in post. So that's one way to do it. And then you have to select all zones. And so all the zones that you have selected in your mapping editor, you can restore the loops. You can copy the current loop setting. So this is a little misleading. You would take the loop setting in your current zone and you would copy it and put it on all the other selected zones. So just be aware of that. You have sample start settings, adjust loop. Now these things have to do with external stuff. Sometimes loops are it has to do with the way you save your samples. So if you're working in like FL Studios and you make a loop, it may have a different way of saving where that loop is by like just a very, very tiny amount. And this basically toggles that around to try and fix it. And then you have this DC removal. Now it should be also determined that these are destructive editing tools. So what does that mean? So if you click this button, it's going to permanently change the sample on your hard drive. It's going to go all the way to the source and change it. So just be aware of that. And now that's really useful if you want, it'll take CPU off and all these things. So if you're editing samples to be permanently changed, this is the way to go. But yeah, and DC offset, I explain what that is, DC removal in my DSP series. Okay, so we've got this these two little arrow guys, whatever. You turn this on, it'll basically keep whatever you're playing in view all times. So if you zoom in real close and then you hit play, you notice that it follows what we're hearing, and that's all that does. So just keep that in mind. Then you have, of course, your regular play options. You have play, you have stop, and then you have this loop option. It will only play our loop setting now. And if we turn this on, we'll see where we are. And so that is an option. And then you have, this is really cool, especially if you're working in drum loops and stuff and you are trying to figure out your samples, but you don't want to have to keep coming up here and push and play and wasting 1,000 clicks trying to do that. Or maybe you've got a MIDI controller hooked up, so it's not even a problem for you. But let's say that that's something you want to do. Well, you can click this autoplay function. And now whenever you're making a change graphically, you have to touch the graph to your sample, it will play back the change. So if we turn our zoom off and we move it, and so you can see it plays it automatically, which can be really handy if you're trying to find just the right point of your drum loop and stuff like that. So great way of doing that. You have this external editor, and you can actually set up an external editor through the options tab. If you go to, I believe it's handling. Yeah, here it is, external wave editor, and you can edit it in an external editor. I've never successfully set this up to work, and I do all my stuff in post or in pre-production. I keep saying post. I mean like while I'm not in Kontakt. Okay, I do it before, so it's pre. And so I just don't use this, but I get these things that say like external editing is not possible for the sample and whatever. It's like, okay, computer, like forget that. I'm just going to go in FL and do it myself. If any of you have set it up successfully to work, maybe I just selected the wrong file or whatever. But anyways, you also have your sample labeled here, and you can scroll between samples and you can see your various zones. If we go to our mapping editor and we look at that here and we play it, you see we're moving through. Now, I'm not sure if this works like the mapping editor where it actually switches the sample out or what's going on. Oh, it does switch the sample out. Good to know. So as you can see, our name is changing here, and from, I'm assuming you watched the mapping editor video, this is exchanging the sample in our zone for another sample in the same folder where our samples are being stored on our computer. So don't use these to switch between samples. Actually click to change your samples, okay? Important note. So really nice to know. And as you see, I have 2 C sharps going on now, and it's all sorts of messed up. But okay, we have our loop start. We already talked about this, or just our starting position. This is where it starts. But then you have this start mod, and we know from earlier tutorials that the mod allows us to control behaviors using envelopes and LFOs and various types of things. So this actually allows you to, if you drag it up here, you see this green line starts to appear. And what does this green line mean? It means that if you were to set like an LFO to control the starting point modulation, it would oscillate between 0 and 1 seconds according to what we've currently got. And you can make it longer, maybe you can make it 2. And so when you start, it'll start in different positions on your sample. And so that is what this does. It allows you to target your starting point with a modulator. So that is really nifty and cool. You have an ending point, which you've already talked about. It's where the ending. You don't have a way to modulate or target it with a modulation source, unfortunately. And then you have this FMT. I forgot format, I believe is what it's for. Anyways, it shows us our bit depth. So this was recorded at 16 bits at 44.1. So maybe you bought a really expensive library that had some false advertising, said it was like 32-bit or something impossible, like 128-bit float at 90,000K, 96K. And it's like, oh no, they lied. It's not true, false advertising. So you can go sue them. So that's what this is good for. And then you have this LEN length, and it just tells you how long your sample is. And if you don't believe it, you can see it on this graph here, just in case you suspect more false advertising. So that is this. If you have any questions about this, drop them in the comments. Like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed day.